Teenage Stories. Story 1. I was a bad kid, and now I'm not talking about your regular teenage delinquency like trying cigarettes, school detention, or getting bad grades. I mean really bad. At age 17, I was shoplifting, stealing cars, and getting picked up by cops for all sorts of things. Not exactly hurting anyone, but I was a constant headache for my mom and dad. After my dad and I almost got into an actual fist fight, he kicked me out of the house. I knew I deserved it, and I knew they figured I'd just go stay with friends for a couple of days, because that's exactly what I did. But me being me, I quickly wore out my welcome at my buddies' houses and ran out of places to stay. But again, me being me, I was way too proud to just go home and apologize. Since it was summertime, I figured it would be a good idea to head down to the park to find somewhere to sleep. I lived in the inner city back then, so there were a bunch of other actual homeless people already sleeping there. As soon as I realized I was actually stuck out there for a night, I started to realize that this homeless thing wasn't a game anymore. As it started to get really late, one of the homeless dudes walked up to me as I started to bed down on the bench and started talking to me. He asked what I was doing, and being naive, I told him. Homelessness immediately responded by saying, "No, you're not," and pretty much guessed the whole deal about me having a falling out with my mom and dad. I didn't want to admit that he was exactly right, so I just kept my mouth shut. But I remember him saying something like, "Really though, kid, if you have kin, you need to pay them a visit, because I promise you ain't ready for this life." My pride kept me out there for 3 whole nights, and every single time I caught up on that bench, the same old homeless dude would walk up and be like, "Go home." In hindsight, he was exactly right. But at the time, he was just another person to prove wrong. My final night on the street also happened to be the first that I tried to integrate myself with the homeless folk who slept in the park. Partially out of boredom and partially out of hunger, I'd run out of money and food. I figured if I hung out with the other guys, I could maybe get in on some of their food or something. I asked around, but no one had any spares until I asked this one guy, and he told me to buzz off. Then I noticed a Snickers bar sticking out of his coat pocket. My rumbling stomach basically overrode my brain, and with all the dexterity of a Victorian pickpocket, I slid the thing out of his pocket and walked off. Not my proudest moment. Stealing food from a homeless guy when I could have just swallowed my pride and walked home. But it is what it is. So, I went off to hide somewhere so I could devour the Snickers whole, and then walked back to where the other guys were to hang out some more. Maybe 2 or 3 hours later, I'm still trying to integrate myself with the homeless guys, but I'm also still pretty nervous about them for obvious reasons. I figured the guy I stole from was too drunk to even notice that I stole from him, but oh boy, was I wrong about that. A few hours after I stole it, I noticed the guy began to tap his coat pocket, obviously noticing that the candy bar was gone. I'm trying to remain inconspicuous, but I'm also trying to keep my eye on the guy, because if he put 2 and 2 together and worked out that it was me that stole from him, I wanted enough warning to be able to get out of there. The guy taps his pocket, then stops. I can see the cogs turning in his booze-soaked brain as he figured he was thinking, "Pretty sure I had some candy in there." But then, a few seconds later, he's back taking pulls from his 40, and I figured he had completely forgotten about the whole thing. Only he hadn't, and the most shocking thing about what came next was how he went from 0 to 100 in like a second flat. So, remember that pull from his 40? He takes 1, then 2, then a third, much larger one, almost like he was trying to polish the whole thing off in a hurry. which, as it turned out, was exactly what he was doing. Because what was once an innocent beverage receptacle soon became a weapon when he turned to the guy to his right and sent the glass 40 bottles smashing into his face. The guy just collapsed, hands covering his face with muffled, blood-curdling screams that he let out, and the guy I stole from then started kicking him, yelling, "If I let him steal from me, motherfucker." Of all the homeless people there, only one actually tried to break it up, and even then, it was just a slurred, "break it up" over there, which ended up being totally ignored. I remember turning to the older dude who had been nice to me, telling me to go home and whatnot, and I feigned ignorance as I asked him what was going on. The guy said the dude getting beat down was always stealing stuff, so if anything went missing around the park, it was most probably his fault. No one cared, though. No one gave a single worry that this guy was getting his face stomped on, and it was all my fault. Oh, and I mean stomped on. I could hear this guy's face literally crunching under this guy's boot. I knew I should have said something. I know I should have owned up. But believe me when I tell you that I've never been that scared, not before or after. All I could think of was, if I tell the truth, that'd be my face getting stomped on. Only, it'll probably be like 100 times worse, because, well, look what I cost. I turned to the nice guy and was like, what if he didn't steal it? What if someone else stole it? The guy looked at me, and his eyes went all wide, and he leaned in and said, "Don't say a word, kid. Just leave and never, ever come back." As I walked away, I could still hear the guy getting his butt beaten. Although I never found out what happened to him, I don't see anyone being able to survive the kind of head injuries he got. That very same night, maybe around 2 a.m., I walked back to my parents' house and banged on the front door until my dad woke up and answered. I just blurted out this big, long apology about being a total idiot and not appreciating what I'd had. I'm pleased to say that was the first step on the road to being a decent human being, because almost everything I did before that had little to no consequences, or rather, while there were, they didn't bother me. But that night I stole the candy bar. I actually saw how bad the repercussions could be, and honestly, I had no idea it could ever be that bad just for taking a candy bar. I feel equal parts shame and horror when I look back on it. My pride and greed caused me to do something shameful, and my cowardice might have cost a relatively innocent man his life. I wish it had never happened, but at the same time, if it didn't, who knows? I might still be hanging out in that park today if I'd even been alive at all. Story 2. This story happened about 4 years ago, back when I was 18 and had just graduated high school. I decided to volunteer for a month in a Southern Asian country before my university started. Since volunteering was something I always wanted to do, I managed to find a place to volunteer at and was supposed to live for the first week with family friends. Then, I started living at my workplace. However, my workplace couldn't house me due to construction and having another female volunteer coming soon. So I had to find a hotel to stay at, which was probably my biggest mistake. I went on the internet and found a hostel in the center of the city in a relatively safe area. The hostel had many great reviews from foreigners, so I thought it was safe. I visited the hostel and was greeted by Jin, who was the nephew of the owner and responsible for greeting foreigners and showing them around. Jin was in his mid-20s, an average-looking dude, probably around 5'8". I'm 6'3", which will be important later. After I made the arrangements for my stay there and agreed to come the next day, Jin invited me to go on a walk to show me around the neighborhood, which I agreed to. During our walk, he told me about himself, how he lived in the UK for a bit, about his family, and asked me if I smoked. Back then, I was a cool kid, fresh out of high school, so I eagerly told him yes, since I was actually trying to get some bud, but didn't know how. He told me he could get it, and when I came the next day, he'd have some for me. The next day, I went to the hostel, and Jin told me that he couldn't get it, so I had to go with him to his friend George's place to get it. In hindsight, that was a big red flag, but I was a dumb kid who really wanted to smoke, so of course I said yes. George almost looked like a cartoon villain, sharp, narrow facial features, and a little Van Dyke beard to go with it. We all got into a tuk-tuk and drove to the slums of the city to meet the dealer. We got the bud, and they told me we were making a stop at George's house to smoke there for a bit. Fine with me. I had no reason to suspect them, since they were nice and polite to me. We reached his house, still within the slum area. It was a small room with a bed and 3 chairs, nothing else. No tables or decor or anything. I sat on a chair, Jin sat on my right, and George sat on the bed, rolling out some joints for us. We started smoking and talking. They started asking me about why I was there, how old I was, and stuff like that. Suddenly, it became a little too personal, asking me what my parents do for a living, how much they make, and the one that really caught my attention, who were the people I lived with, and if they would worry if I didn't call them soon. I was stoned, but the moment they said that, I started sobering up quickly, realizing that I was in a messed up situation. I told them I was supposed to call in a few hours, and that they knew which hostel I was staying at. Suddenly, another guy came and just stood at the doorway, completely blocking it. He was about my height, but much bigger in size. I was trapped between them and had nowhere to go. Luckily, they couldn't do anything to me yet since I told them I was supposed to make a phone call to my family friends. Starting to get very nervous and anxious, I told them I was too baked and couldn't move, so I kept passing up on my turn to smoke. I just lay there acting as if I was tired. In my mind, they started speaking in their native language, and it was clear to me that they were actually talking about me. Jin told them about the electronics I had and that I had paid for my full stay in cash. George, bless his soul, thought I wasn't aware of my surroundings. In perfect English, Jin started mocking me, kept saying, "Nice phone," and asked if I knew how to swim. I just looked at him, smiled, and told them it was time to go because I was starting to get tired. We walked out, and I told them I needed to go to the market real fast and asked if they needed anything. They kept telling me that they'd get me whatever I wanted themselves, but I insisted that I wanted to go and that they should send one of them with me. They sent the big guy. The market was across the street from a bus station. Buses there don't stop at the station. They just slow down, and you hop in and hop out. So now was my chance. I waited until I saw a bus approaching, sprinted like my life depended on it, and it did, and hopped in. They were screaming at me to come back and started running after the bus. At one point, I even heard one of them scream, "You're lucky!" And the moment the bus reached the neighborhood of the family friends, I hopped out and walked around the neighborhood. In the morning, I went to work and told them the tuk-tuk driver had tried to kidnap me. They escorted me to the hostel where I took my belongings, and work allowed me to stay with them, thank God. When I told my family friends what happened, they told me it's a common scam there. They were planning to steal my belongings and dump me in the river when they left the house. That's why they asked if I knew how to swim and if someone was expecting me. Story 3. I grew up in Northern California in a quite poor rural area. Some of my best friends from elementary and middle school lived like 10 to 15 miles away, so on weekends, instead of just going over to visit for the day, we'd have sleepovers to save our parents from driving on these crazy road trips. I had this one friend called Star, whose parents were like old school hippies. Their house always smelled of patchouli, and they were vegan even before veganism was really a thing. Aside from a few unusual recreational activities, they were basically just as good at being parents as any other couple. They were sweet, loving, and attentive, and I always had a ball whenever I went to sleep over at their place, mainly because they let us stay outdoors and tent at night, which was just a huge adventure for a little group of preteen boys. Anyway, this one night, we are staying in a tent in the backyard. The backyard extended to one side of the house where we camped and was in view of the TV room window, so Star's mom and dad could keep an eye on us. But it also meant we could see the driveway from the flap of our tent. It was summertime, so it was still incredibly warm at night. We ended up leaving the tent flap unzipped to let some cool air in. It obviously wasn't open all the way because of the bugs, but we could still see outside the tent. Then, in the middle of the night, Star shakes me awake and whispers, "There's someone in the driveway." I thought it might have been her big brother, who was a few years older than us and attending college. But when I suggested that, she said, "No, it's a bunch of people. Look." I started getting really anxious hearing that, so I quietly crept up to the tent flap to peek out. That's when I saw that Star was exactly right. In the little bit of moonlight that we had, I literally lost count of the number of people I saw creeping up the driveway. It was seriously one of the scariest moments of my life, mainly because there was absolutely nothing to do but keep as quiet as possible. We couldn't call the cops. This was way before cell phones. We couldn't warn Star's parents without revealing our presence. We were just powerless, forced to watch people who obviously didn't have good intentions slowly approaching Star's house. I think in the end, Star just broke. In a move you could either call real brave or real stupid, she just ran out of the tent shouting, "Get away from my house, Mom! Dad! Call the cops!" As soon as she started screaming, a bunch of flashlights burst to life, obviously held by the guys sneaking up the driveway. Oh my God, there were so many of them. At first glance in the darkness, it looked like no more than about 5 or 6 people. But when they all turned their flashlights on, it was clear the number was more like 15 or 20. I just heard the sheriff saying, "Show me your hands." It was incredibly confusing because we were all about calling the cops to get help. But the cops were already here. Anyway, Star did as she was told, and so did me and my other friends. We started climbing out of our tent with our hands in the air. That was when the person approaching us started saying, "Jesus, they're just kids, man." And with them being closer, I could see that they really were cops, with caps, badges, and all the patches on their arms and all that stuff. I heard them say, "Go, go, go, get in there." And the cops started bashing the front door to the house. Other cops gathered around the backyard and headed towards one of the barns. We were scared, obviously, but more focused on just staying down and watching. We weren't really freaking out too bad, but when the cops started dragging Star's mom and dad out of the house and arresting them, she had to be restrained by the cop that was guarding us. After that, the cops drove me and her friends back to our respective homes. Then, I don't know what they did with Star. I think they took her to her grandma's or aunt's or whatever. But then, a few days later, we found out that Star's mom and dad had been growing something they shouldn't have in one of their barns. I get that it was illegal and stuff, But the aftermath was just so sad. Star had to go live with her relatives because her parents were sent off to prison for a few years. It was messed up, and I get that the cops were just doing their job and stuff, but it was definitely one of the scariest times of my life. Seeing all those figures in black just creeping towards my friend's house